The archivist who reconstructed the events of that night worked from 5 sources: the automated defense platform logs of Viltrum's outer orbital ring, the Imperial Deployment Authority's recall authorization stamped 22 years after Mark Grayson's original Earth posting and flagged as a standard midpoint compliance summons, the arrival processing records of the Imperial Genetic Authority, the personal testimony of 2 analysts who were present for the screening and who both requested reassignment to outer territory postings within a week of the event, and a single entry in the Royal Guardian appointment records that reads, in its entirety, Mark Grayson elevated. Effective immediately, by order of the Grand Regent. What the archivist could not reconstruct, what no record captured, was the sound of interstellar space during the journey, which was not silence. Silence implies the absence of something that should be there. Space had no such implication. It simply was what it was, a medium through which a single body moved at speeds that the physics of smaller things had no framework for, carrying something against its chest that had not asked to be carried. Nolan did not look back. There was nothing behind him that he had decided to look at. The compliance review had been routine, a procedural flag generated by the length of his Earth posting, which had extended to 22 years without an in-person administrative accounting. He had received the summons 3 months before departure and spent those 3 months making the calculations available to him. The infant's Viltrumite biology had been expressing since the earliest weeks with an acceleration that no human environment could account for or manage. Without generating questions, he had no framework to answer to a species that did not know what Viltrumites were. He had made the relevant calculations. The infant could not stay. He did not examine what the calculations had cost him to make. The infant Mark weighed approximately 8 pounds. The Viltrumite material wrapped around him was engineered to a tensile strength capable of surviving atmospheric re-entry. Not because Nolan anticipated re-entry being a problem, but because Viltrumite instinct, when protecting something, defaulted to engineering rather than tenderness. The wrap was not soft, it was adequate. The infant slept inside it with the uncomplicated absoluteness of something too young to understand the distance, accumulating between itself and the world where it had been born. Nolan's face, had anyone been positioned to observe it, communicated nothing. He had made his calculation. He had executed his decision. The specific quality of a Viltrumite in transit was exactly this, the focused emptiness of a system that had committed to a vector and was completing it. He did not examine the weight against his chest. He did not examine the decision that had produced the weight. He flew. The journey took 11 days. Viltrum resolved from a point of darkness into something with dimension across the final hours of approach. The spire cities came visible first, not because they were the largest features on the planet, but because they were the highest, rising through the upper cloud layer in formations of dark, dense stone that caught the orbital light wrong, not reflected it, absorbed most of it, and gave back the minimum. The architecture of a world that had decided, somewhere in its 3rd or 4th millennium, that beauty was a category error. The planet's sky at this hour was a bruised purple-gray, the specific color produced by particulates still cycling through the upper atmosphere from volcanic events that had ended 3,000 years ago and whose debris had never fully settled. It looked like the aftermath of something. It always looked like the aftermath of something. This was not considered a problem by the civilization living beneath it. The automated defense platforms clocked Nolan's approach at the outer orbital ring and went active in the specific way of systems that are very good at their function and have no interest in anything outside it. He broadcast his identification codes without breaking velocity. 6 seconds passed, long enough that the audio drama's sound design should fill the space with the specific frequency of active targeting systems holding a lock. And then the platform stood down, and a 2 Viltrumite escort materialized from a holding position to his right. Not a welcome. A supervision. The difference was understood by everyone involved. He descended through the cloud layer without acknowledgement of the escort. The city below was exactly as he had left it, which it would be because Viltrum did not change on a scale that a 2-year absence could measure. The spire towers cast shadows across the lower districts in the same angles they had always cast them. The pits were where they always were, carved into the bedrock, the sounds from the lowest levels not quite reaching the surface at this hour. The throne plateau sat at the planet's geographic center, exactly as it had for 11 centuries. The open-air imperial court structure, at its peak communicating to anyone approaching from altitude, the thing it was designed to communicate. The sky belongs to us. He landed at the Imperial Genetic Authority processing facility at 0300 local time, which he had timed specifically. Not to avoid attention, there was no scenario in which the Grand Regent's monitoring apparatus failed to log his return. He had timed it because the night processing rotation was smaller, which meant the number of people present when the results came through would be the minimum available. It was an instinct. He did not examine where it came from. The analyst who processed the initial screening was a Viltrumite of approximately 400 years, who had spent 2 centuries in the Genetic Authority and had developed the specific professional detachment of someone who handles information that other beings find significant and has learned to treat it as data. She took the infant from Nolan's arms with clinical competence, placed him in the scanning array, and ran the standard protocol. The standard protocol took 9 minutes. At minute 7, the system flagged. She cleared the flag and ran the sequence again, which was standard operating procedure for anomalous results. At minute 11, it flagged in the same place. She pulled Nolan's genetic record from the deployment files. It took her 3 minutes to find what she was looking for, and another 4 to understand what she had found. The Argol sequence existed in his genome, but existed in it the way a structural element exists when 3,000 years of subsequent construction have been built around rather than on top of it. Present, technically load-bearing, registered by standard Viltrumite scanning algorithms as background genetic variation, rather than as an active bloodline marker. There were thousands of similar traces across any Viltrumite genome, absorbed lineages, rendered inert by generations of pure blood consolidation. The algorithm had no mechanism for flagging them as significant in a full-blooded subject, because in a full-blooded subject, they were not significant. The hybrid was a different environment. The human genetic architecture had provided an expression context that Viltrumite biology alone had suppressed for centuries. In Nolan, the sequence was inert, background noise that no scan had ever had reason to elevate. In the infant, it was not a classification question. It was the answer to a question the Empire had stopped asking 300 years ago. She stared at the display for 3 seconds, the specific 3 seconds of a person whose professional detachment has just encountered something it was not built to contain. And then she sent a request to the night supervisor. The night supervisor came, looked at the display, sent a request to the senior analyst on call. By 0400, there were 7 people in a room that normally held 2, and the infant Mark was asleep in the scanning array with the same uncomplicated absoluteness he had maintained for 11 days of interstellar transit, and every person in the room had the same expression. The specific confusion of someone confronting a result that cannot be correct, and demonstrably is. The Argol sequence was not subtle. It was not a marginal marker, not an ambiguous reading that required specialist interpretation. It was present in the genome the way a structural element is present in architecture. Load-bearing, unmistakable, the kind of thing that, once you understood what you were looking at, you could not look at as anything else. The bloodline that the imperial records listed as extinct, the lineage that the Grand Regent's office had confirmed in writing on 4 separate occasions across the past 3 centuries, did not exist in any living Viltrumite. The senior analyst looked at Nolan. Nolan looked at the senior analyst. His expression communicated nothing because he had no expression available for this situation. He had not known. The bloodline had not been part of any calculation he had made. The mission's intent had been the planet itself, its population, its resources, its readiness for integration. The child had been a consequence of the years rather than a calculation of them. It had been intended to be nothing at all. The senior analyst sent one message to the Grand Regent's office. The message contained 2 words: "He is confirmed." Thragg arrived within the hour. The room had not gotten louder in the intervening time. It had gotten quieter, which was a different thing. The quiet of people who have understood something and are managing themselves carefully while they wait for the person who will tell them what understanding it means for them. The analysts stood at their stations. The supervisor stood near the door. Nolan stood where he had been standing since 0300, which was beside the scanning array, which was where the infant was. Thragg entered without announcement, because announcement was a courtesy that implied the recipient had the option of being unprepared, and Thragg did not extend that option to rooms he entered. He was massive in the way of something that had been built rather than grown. Not broad in the approximate way of physical strength, but specific, every measurement calibrated toward a single function. He wore the Grand Regent's markings with the ease of something that has carried a weight for so long it no longer registers as weight. He crossed the room. The analysts in his path moved without being asked, and without appearing to notice they were moving. the way objects move out of the way of water. He stopped in front of Nolan. He had no bloodline claim of his own. He had never needed one. What he had was 3 centuries of accumulated administrative architecture and the uncontested understanding that strength was the only currency Viltrum actually ran on, and he controlled the supply. The bloodline model was a political technology from an older era. He had outlasted it. Or he had believed he had outlasted it, which was the distinction now resolving itself with uncomfortable clarity in his operational awareness. He looked at the infant in the scanning array. He looked at Nolan's face, reading it with the complete attention of a being who had spent centuries reading faces for the information they tried not to give. He found what he was looking for. Nolan was genuinely stunned. This had not been a maneuver. This had been an accident. The man had returned for a compliance review, brought his son as a variable he couldn't leave unmanaged, and handed the Empire its legitimate heir without knowing he was doing it. The political calculus happened during the walk across the room. Every option, run in parallel, evaluated against every available variable. The infant could not be killed here, now, with 7 witnesses present and the genetic results already transmitted through the standard auto-distribution protocol to 14 administrative nodes across the Imperial network, before the anomalous flag had even been raised. The data existed in places that would take days to reach and hours to scrub from each, and in the interval between now and the completion of that process, the story would exist in 7 pairs of eyes, and the specific human, the specific Viltrumite, tendency to tell things that shouldn't be told. He could not make the infant not exist. Not tonight. Not in this room. He stopped in front of Nolan and he looked at the child for a long moment, and then he did something that no one in the room had ever seen him do, and that most Viltrumites alive had never seen him do, because the last occasion requiring it had been before most of them were born. He lowered himself to one knee. The room's quality changed the way the air changes, before something that cannot be taken back. Thragg's knee met the stone floor without ceremony, without drama, with the absolute precision of a being performing a function he has decided to perform and has not decided to perform with anything other than complete control. He spoke the formal words of royal acknowledgement. They were old, older than his tenure as Grand Regent, older than anyone present except possibly Thragg himself, words from the era when the acknowledgement had last been necessary. He spoke them correctly, without inflection, in the original ceremonial cadence that the occasion required. He rose. His expression had not changed during the kneeling or the rising. His breathing had not changed. He turned to the room. Nolan Grayson is elevated to Royal Guardian. His voice carried to every corner without effort. Effective, immediately, by the Grand Regent's authority. He will be assigned to the Prince's detail and will maintain continuous proximity to the heir until further order. The analysts looked at each other after he was gone, and then looked at their displays, and then did not look at each other again, because what they had just seen was the kind of thing that a person decided, instinctively, to be careful about having seen. The honor was announced to the wider court the following morning. By the time the day session convened, every Viltrumite on the homeworld with any proximity to the administrative apparatus had heard, an heir, confirmed. Argal's line, living, present, asleep in a scanning array in the Genetic Authority Processing Facility. Nolan spent the announcement session receiving formal congratulations from sector generals and command rank officers who had been trained since earliest development to recognize bloodline significance and respond to it with the appropriate reverence. He stood beside the infant's secured transport unit and accepted each acknowledgement with the formal precision his new title required. He said the correct things. He stood the correct way. He performed the role with the same focused emptiness that had carried him through 11 days of interstellar transit. After the session, his assigned quarters were in the Imperial complex. The Royal Guardian's suite was adjacent to the heir's rooms, separated by one wall, connected by a secured passage, close enough that a Viltrumite's hearing would register any sound that needed registering. It was, structurally, exactly what the title implied. It was also, structurally, a cage with excellent views. That night, Nolan stood on the edge of the spire tower nearest the complex and looked at the sky. The bruised purple of the atmosphere had deepened into something closer to black at altitude. The moon's risen, casting the kind of light that did not warm anything it touched. He could not see Earth from here. It was in the wrong direction. Lost somewhere in the starfield, a point of reflected light that his eyes could not resolve from 10,000 similar points, even if he knew exactly where to look. He had held his son today while the most dangerous being alive knelt in front of him, and the word for what he felt was not triumph, and was not relief, and was not anything that Viltrumite vocabulary had a precise term for. Below him, in a secured room in the Imperial complex, the infant was asleep, 8 pounds of confirmed legitimate bloodline, sleeping with the uncomplicated absoluteness of something that did not yet know what it was. Nolan looked at the stars. He did not move for a long time. The moons continued their transit above him. The city below him continued its night. He did not name what he was feeling. He was not at this moment able to. The pits did not smell like blood exactly. Blood was a component, but blood alone was too simple a description for what accumulated in 30 feet of enclosed stone over years of continuous use. It smelled like the specific compound of exertion and mineral, and something older than both, the particular residue of a place where a civilization had been sending its children for centuries and taking back whatever survived. The stone walls were dark and dense, the same volcanic rock that composed the spire cities above, quarried from the planet's bedrock at depths where the pressure had compressed it into something that absorbed force rather than cracking under it. This was deliberate. The walls were not there to break. The children were. Vignette 1, age 7. The cohort supervisor did not introduce herself. She was a Viltrumite of perhaps 600 years, built with the economical density of someone who had never carried anything unnecessary. And she looked at the 7-year-old Mark with the specific expression of a person performing an assessment rather than making an observation. She registered his features, the black hair of Nolan's line, the bone structure that was almost Viltrumite, and carried in its almost a record of everything that made him not quite, and she did not react to any of it. She picked him up by the back of his collar. She carried him to the pit's edge the way a person carries a piece of equipment to where it will be used, and she dropped him in. 30 feet. He hit the stone floor without tucking. He hadn't been taught to tuck, hadn't been taught anything yet, was operating entirely on the biological reflexes of a body that was Viltrumite enough to survive the fall, and human enough to feel every foot of it on the way down. He landed wrong on his left side and lay still for 2 seconds, not stunned, just running inventory. What was reporting damage? What wasn't? Where the pain was sharpest? There were 3 children already in the pit. 8, 9, and 10 years old. They had been here long enough to have learned one functional truth about the environment. New arrivals were easier than established children, and easier was a resource. The 10-year-old moved first. The fight lasted 40 seconds and covered most of the pit floor. Mark lost it decisively. He was smaller, slower, undertrained against opponents who had spent months developing the specific instincts that the pit produced. He took a hit to his left arm that produced a sound that was wrong in the particular way that bone sounds wrong, and the arm reported damage that would take weeks to correct, rather than the days a pure-blood child's biology would have required. He did not make a sound when the bone gave, not from bravery. Bravery was a performance, and performance required an audience you wanted to impress. And Mark, at 7 years old, had already processed enough of his environment to understand that the 3 children in this pit were not an audience he could afford to perform for. He made no sound, because making a sound produced a response in opponents that gave them something to work with, and he had registered this in the first 20 seconds of the fight, without being taught to register it. He set the bone himself. He found the wall and used it, pressing the brake against the stone at the angle that would hold it straight, while the biology did what his biology did, which was slower than it should have been, and faster than a human child's would have been, and not at all the right speed for what this place required. Then he sat down against the wall and watched the other 3, and began to learn. Vignette 2, age 9. Conquest had been watching from the observation ring above the pit for 11 weeks before he came down. He had been assigned to observe by Thragg, specifically to identify weaknesses, physical or behavioral, that might provide convenient opportunities for the kind of accident that left no evidence requiring explanation. He had spent 11 weeks looking for those weaknesses, and had found, instead, something that irritated him in the specific way that things irritated Conquest, something that refused to be what he had decided it was. The half-blood child was not thriving. That was accurate. He was slower to develop than every pure blood in the cohort. His recovery time was wrong. His strength curve was behind by a margin that was measurable and significant. He was losing fights he should not have still been losing at 9 years old, but he was losing them differently than he had at 7. He was losing them in the way of someone who was extracting something from each loss, Not lessons exactly, not anything that deliberate, but something that accumulated. The specific bruises on his opponents were moving. They were in different places than they had been 2 months ago, which meant he was hitting different places, which meant he was making decisions mid-fight that he had not been making before. Conquest dropped into the pit. The children scattered to the walls the way the cohort always scattered when something significantly larger entered the space. Mark did not scatter. He assessed, 1 full second of reading the new variable, and then held his position, which was almost certainly the wrong decision for a 9-year-old facing the most feared active combatant in the Viltrumite military, and which Conquest noted with the flat attention of someone adding a data point to an ongoing evaluation. He stopped in front of the child and looked down at him from full height, with the specific attention of someone inspecting a piece of work they have not yet decided whether to find adequate. "You don't know what you are," Conquest said. Mark looked back up at him. His left arm had healed crooked from the first week and been rebroken and reset twice since then, and the scar tissue around it was already developing the particular density that Viltrumite healing produced in repeatedly stressed areas. He said, "I know exactly what I am." "You know what your blood says." Conquest's voice carried no more weight than stating a geological fact. "That's not the same thing." He did not elaborate. He was not in the habit of elaborating. A thing said was a thing said, and what the recipient did with it was the recipient's problem. He had no interest in whether the child processed it correctly. He was here to assess a variable, not develop one. Mark spent the next 3 years thinking about it. He did not reach a conclusion for most of that time. The conclusion, when it came, was not the one Conquest had intended, and was more accurate than the one Conquest had intended, which was a pattern that would repeat. Conquest came back. Not once, 7 more times over the following years, without prior notice, without stated purpose, descending into the pit or the training grounds when Mark was present, and engaging him with the full and undivided output of someone who was not practicing. He did not explain the visits. He did not offer correction or instruction between exchanges. He came, he fought, and he left, and the gap between what Mark could manage against him at 9 years old and what Mark could manage against him at 14 was the only record either of them kept. It was not mentorship. Conquest did not mentor. It was the specific kind of attention a being pays to something it has identified as a variable worth monitoring, expressed in the only language Conquest found natural. Vignette 3, age 11. The chamber above the pits had no chairs. Anissa stood in front of a projected star map that covered the entirety of the north wall, the known galaxy rendered in points of cold light. The Empire's territories marked in a deep amber that covered more of the display than not, and she waited for Mark to settle before she began. He sat cross-legged on the stone floor with the complete, unblinking attention of a child who had been learning for 4 years that information was a resource, and resources were not wasted. She taught him the geography of the conquered galaxy, the administrative model of subject worlds, the political relationships between sector generals, and the specific historical moments when those relationships had shifted. She taught him the history of the purges that had produced the current Viltrumite population, not as tragedy, not as achievement, but as data. This is what the species did. This is what it produced. This is where the current military capability comes from. She taught him the Argal bloodline. She covered it last, and she covered it completely. What the bloodline meant in Viltrumite law, what it meant in Viltrumite culture, why warriors who had served for centuries under Thragg's administration still carried a specific category of loyalty that Thragg's administration had never fully captured, and had spent centuries pretending was not there. She told him what his blood meant to the Empire. She told him, without stating it directly, what it meant to the man who was not allowing it to be confirmed through proper channels. She did not call Thragg a threat. She did not use any word that would require her to have said something she could be accountable for saying. She simply gave Mark the complete picture and let the picture be what it was. When she finished, Mark sat with it for a moment. Then he asked, how many of the Vanguard are loyal to him personally versus loyal to the position? Anissa went quiet. The question was not what she had expected from an 11-year-old. It was not what she had expected from most adults. It was the question that cut directly to the load-bearing element of everything she had just laid out. Not is Thragg a threat, which was the obvious question, but where exactly does his power actually live, which was the useful one. She told him. She gave him the numbers, the names, the specific relationships, and something shifted between them in the giving of it. She had been evaluating him since the assignment began, and the evaluation had just reached its conclusion. He was not a child with royal blood. He was something that was going to be a problem for everyone who had not prepared for it, and she filed this assessment in the category of things she would need to keep current. Vignette 4, age 13. 3 pit combatants, 15, 16, and 17 years old. Full-blooded Viltrumite, all of them, each one significantly larger and further developed than the 13-year-old half-blood they had been placed with. The instructions they had received were not written down. Instructions of this kind were never written down. They had been delivered verbally by a member of the Vanguard who had used the specific phrasing that communicated everything necessary without stating anything accountable. The Grand Regent believes the prince requires a genuine test of his current ceiling. Do not moderate your output. What followed was not a fight in the conventional sense. It was a sustained attempt by 3 significantly superior opponents to push one inferior opponent past the point of continuance, and it nearly worked 3 separate times in the first 4 minutes. The first near end, the 17-year-old got Mark against the wall and applied force at a concentrated point. The throat, which on a Viltrumite was durable but not invulnerable, and on a half-blood was the closest available approximation of a critical point. Mark got out by doing something wrong. Not a technique, not a trained response, but a desperate improvisation that connected with the 17-year-old's knee at an angle that no trained fighter would have used, because no trained fighter would have been in the position that required it. It worked because it was wrong. The 17-year-old adjusted and came again. The second near end, all 3 simultaneously. The audio of this beat should be specific. 3 impacts in close sequence. The sound of a body hitting stone, the particular quality of breathing that means something structural has been stressed past its preference. Mark on the floor, 3 opponents standing. The conventional outcome from this position was a static one. He got up. The third near end was the worst and produced damage that lingered. 2 ribs that did not sit correctly for a month, a laceration above his left eye that healed slowly enough to scar. He was not standing correctly when the fight ended. He was standing, which was the only criterion the pit applied. He looked up at the observation ring. He was not looking for Nolan. Nolan was in the complex, fulfilling his guardian role from the approved distance, which he always was. He was looking because he had already registered, at some point in the previous 4 minutes, the specific presence that was watching from the ring's far end. Thragg looked back at him. It was the first time they had truly occupied each other's attention simultaneously, and the quality of it was not what either of them might have described as comfortable. Mark's expression, through the blood and the wrong-sitting ribs, communicated something that Thragg had not calculated for. Not defiance, not fear, not the desperate survival relief of a child who has just survived something that was supposed to end differently. Knowledge. The shape of it. Not the specifics yet. Not the Vanguard's instructions. Not the verbal-only delivery. Not the specific accountabilities. But the shape. Someone had arranged this, and it was not the cohort system's standard protocol. And Mark had been in this environment long enough to know what standard protocol felt like. He walked away from the pit. He did not look back at the observation ring. Walking away was not a statement. It was simply the completion of the event, the exit from one space into the next. He did not perform anything for the audience above him, which was, itself, the statement. Vignette 5, age 15. Nolan found him on the edge of the spire tower at dusk. The bruised purple of the sky was deepening toward its nighttime black, the moon's not yet risen. The city below settling into the particular quality of Viltrumite evening. Not quiet exactly, but lower frequency. The pits closed for the night cycle, the spire towers casting their last angular shadows. He had brought nothing. He had no prepared speech. He had been preparing something for 3 days and had arrived at the edge of the spire, and found that the preparation was gone, and what remained was simpler and worse. He just wanted to see how his son was doing. He did not have a Viltrumite framework for that want, and a human framework that he had not used in 15 years, and which had rusted into something he could not fully operate. Mark spoke first. "You wanted to tell me something, Nolan. I wanted to see how you were doing." The look lasted long enough to be a complete assessment. The same look he had given the 3 opponents at 13, reading variables, identifying what was actually present versus what was being presented. That's not a Viltrumite question. The conversation did not go well after that. Nolan reached for connection the way a person reaches for something in the dark. approximately, without confidence in the coordinates. Mark received each reach with the polite, formal precision of someone who understood the language being attempted and did not functionally speak it. He was not cold. Cold implied withholding something that was present underneath. There was nothing being withheld. The architecture simply did not have the room that Nolan was looking for. By the time Nolan left, both of them had arrived at the same understanding through different routes. Something had been determined here. Not decided. Determination implied a moment of choice. This had been a gradual arrival, spread across 15 years and 1,000 small daily facts. And the spire tower at dusk was simply the place where both of them acknowledged the destination they had already reached. Mark remained on the tower's edge after Nolan left. The sky continued its transit toward black above him. Below, the city moved through its evening. He was not thinking about the conversation. He was already past it, in the way of someone for whom a data point has been processed and filed, and the processing is complete. He was thinking about the Vanguard loyalty numbers Anissa had given him 4 years ago. He was thinking about whether they had shifted. He was thinking about how to find out. The mission assignment system had an elegant quality that Mark had identified and catalogued by the time he was 16. It took him another year to confirm it was deliberate rather than incidental, because the difference between a pattern and a policy was evidence, and evidence required patience. The pattern, every mission Thragg assigned him, was calibrated wrong. Not obviously wrong, not wrong in a way that could be presented to an imperial tribunal and identified as malfeasance. Wrong in the way of a scale that has been adjusted by a careful hand. Slightly off, consistently off, always off in the same direction. The official mission parameters described one level of resistance. The actual resistance, when Mark arrived, described another. The support allocation was consistently below what the stated threat level warranted. The communications infrastructure in the assigned zones had a reliable tendency toward degraded signal. Not blackout, just degraded. Just enough lag to mean that a distress transmission would arrive somewhere between too late and not at all. Thragg had spent centuries constructing this system, and Mark had spent 1 year confirming it. He went on the missions anyway. Refusing was a political error he could not afford, and dying was an outcome he had been refusing since he was 7 years old in a pit that smelled like stone and blood, and the specific residue of a civilization's methodology. He did not tell Nolan. Nolan would have acted on the information, and acting on the information would have been a move without sufficient support, and an insufficient move was worse than no move. He did not tell Anissa. Not yet. He flew the missions and came back and filed his reports in 12 words or fewer, and waited. Station Krev. 7 sat at the outer edge of the Empire's 3rd territorial boundary, a waypoint installation built into the dead rock of an asteroid, large enough to anchor it, and small enough to ignore. Suspended in the specific nowhere of deep space that existed between places that mattered. The Flaxen incursion had established a foothold in the station's lower 3 levels, approximately 6 weeks before Mark received the assignment briefing. The briefing was thorough and accurate in its description of the Flaxen forces' composition. It was calibrated wrong in its assessment of what those forces required to remove. The standard Imperial response to a Flaxen foothold of this size and configuration was a squad of 6. Not because 6 was the minimum, but because 6 provided enough redundancy that if the Flaxens had developed anything new since their last incursion, you found out about it with warriors to spare. Mark received 2 support warriors, both of middling capability. Both he had confirmed through a cross-reference of Anissa's Vanguard loyalty assessment against current assignment rosters, with operational histories that ran through Thragg's direct command. He noted this. He departed. The Flaxens had developed something since their last incursion. Their aging suppression technology was not new. The Empire's intelligence apparatus had been tracking its development for decades, and the briefing had included the relevant parameters. What the briefing had not included, because the intelligence apparatus had not yet caught it, was that the suppression units had been miniaturized. Previous Flaxen incursion forces had relied on centralized suppression installations, large, fixed, identifiable. The units now were distributed. Personal scale. Every Flaxen soldier in the station carried one. Mark identified this in the first 4 hours after arrival, during which he did not engage. He left the 2 support warriors at the station's outer access point and told them he was conducting reconnaissance. They accepted this. He did not explain further, and they did not ask, which told him the things about them that he had already suspected. He spent 4 hours moving through the station's maintenance infrastructure, access shafts, and conduit corridors built for the station's repair systems, not for combat, which meant they were too small for a Flaxan soldier in full equipment, and navigable for a 17-year-old with flight capability who was comfortable in confined spaces. The pits had been confined spaces. He was very comfortable. He mapped the Flaxan positions. He identified the suppression unit distribution pattern. He identified something else. The units were networked. They communicated with each other to maintain a synchronized suppression field, which solved the Flaxan problem of managing temporal differential across a dispersed force, but introduced a structural dependency that a networked system always introduced. If the network's synchronization was disrupted, the units would desynchronize. A desynchronized suppression field was not a suppression field. It was a collection of individual units producing competing frequencies that would, in practice, invert the aging effect rather than simply removing it, amplifying the temporal differential rather than counteracting it. He moved at the end of the 4th hour. The engagement lasted 11 minutes and covered 4 of the station's 6 active levels. He did not fight the Flaxan forces. He moved through them, not avoiding contact exactly, but treating contact as a friction cost rather than an objective, taking hits he could absorb, and redirecting his line where he could, keeping his velocity high enough that the Flaxan targeting systems were always acquiring a position he had already left. His body reported damage during the 11 minutes, a strike to the right side that would produce significant bruising by the time he returned to the access point, a Flaxan energy discharge that connected with his left shoulder and burned through the outer layers of his suit into skin beneath it. He noted both and kept moving. The synchronization hub was on the station's 4th level, in a room that the Flaxan commanders had chosen for its central position, and which Mark had identified from the network traffic pattern in the 2nd hour of his reconnaissance. He reached it in the 9th minute of the engagement, with 2 Flaxan soldiers in pursuit, and a third attempting to cut off his approach vector from the corridor to his left. He hit the synchronization hub with the concentrated force of a body that had been developed for 8 years in a place specifically designed to develop such force, and the hub stopped synchronizing. The Flaxans inside the station began aging. Not gradually. The desynchronized field was not simply removing their suppression, but inverting it, the competing frequencies amplifying the temporal differential rather than counteracting it. What had taken the suppression years to neutralize was released and reversed in seconds. The soldiers nearest the hub aged decades in under 2 minutes. Bodies that had been combat capable when the engagement began, now registering the accumulated weight of years they had not been designed to absorb simultaneously. They were not dead. They were not capable of continuing. The distinction, in practical terms, did not constitute a meaningful tactical difference. He moved through the remaining resistance with the methodical efficiency of someone completing a task, not fighting a battle. He was at the Imperial reporting station 6 hours after departure. The 2 support warriors had not moved from the access point. He looked at them when he returned. They looked at him, at the burn on his shoulder, at the bruising developing along his right side, at the fact that he was standing in front of them 6 hours later when their internal calculation had been calibrated toward a different outcome. Their expressions communicated something they were not controlling well enough to conceal, which told him the remainder of what he needed to know about them. He did not address it. He sat down at the reporting terminal and composed his transmission. Flaxan incursion at Station Krev. 7. Suppressed. No Viltrumite casualties. Await next assignment. 12 words. He transmitted it and stood and told the support warriors they were returning to Viltrum. He did not explain what had happened inside the station. He did not explain why they had not been included. He simply did not acknowledge their presence as a variable in the mission's outcome, because acknowledging it would give them something to respond to, and he had nothing to gain from their response. The return journey to Viltrum took 3 days. He spent them reviewing Anissa's most recent political briefing on the Lofan system. The Lofans had been technically subjugated for 3 generations. Their resistance was not military. They had evaluated that option and correctly concluded it was not an option, but administrative. They had developed across decades of careful, incremental adjustment, the specific art of producing the minimum output required to avoid direct imperial retaliation, while never providing enough to constitute genuine compliance. Thragg's administrators had flagged it as a political problem. Thragg had flagged it as Mark's next assignment. The calibration was the same as always. A forceful clarification of this nature, a subject world that had been managing its non-compliance for 3 generations, typically warranted a Viltrumite commander with administrative experience and a supporting diplomatic apparatus. Mark received the assignment alone, with a note that the prince should demonstrate his capacity for independent political resolution. He arrived on Lofan without a warship. He flew alone, which was both the most efficient approach and the one that communicated the specific message he wanted to communicate before he said a word. One of us, by ourselves. Consider what that implies about how seriously we are taking your resistance. He landed in the center of their primary governmental structure and stood in the entrance hall and asked to speak with the council. Not demanded, asked in the formal register of a request, which confused the Lofan administrative staff enough that they complied before they had time to formulate a refusal. The council chamber was built for a species that communicated partly through color change in their cranial membranes. The architecture accounted for lighting that would make these changes visible, which meant the room was bright in a way that Viltrumite spaces never were. Mark sat across from 11 Lofan counselors in a room that felt like the inside of a sun and showed nothing on his face and waited for them to finish their formal greeting. Then he laid it out. He did not use threats, not implied, not stated, not embedded in phrasing. He used logic, which was a different instrument and, in the specific political context of a subject world that had spent 3 generations managing imperial administrators, through their predictable responses, a more effective one, he told them, the current trajectory had one endpoint, and the endpoint was not ambiguous. He was not the one who would create that endpoint. He was, in fact, specifically not going to be the one who created that endpoint, because his presence here was an opportunity that his absence would close. The Viltrumite who came after him would not sit across a council table in a bright room and use the word opportunity. He gave them 48 of their hours. He spent those hours in the Lofan governmental district, walking, not surveilling, not conducting reconnaissance, just present in the space, visible to the civilian population that moved around him, with the specific wide-berth caution of people who had learned over 3 generations to be careful around Viltrumites. He ate nothing, which he did not need to. He slept 4 hours in an empty administrative anteroom, which he needed slightly more than a pureblood would not have. He watched the city move around him and processed what he was seeing with the particular cognitive efficiency that was the one thing he had acknowledged privately, that his half-human biology gave him. He read environments quickly. He read the Lofans quickly. He read the texture of a population managing long-term subjugation, and he understood, without sentiment, what that texture meant about their decision-making. The compliance agreement was signed 47 hours after he gave them 48. He was in transit back to Viltrum when the first report reached him through secondary channels, not official Imperial communications, but the informal network of outer territory personnel that had been developing around his movements for the past 6 months, officers who had served long enough to remember Argal's era, warriors who had spent decades under an administration they followed because they had no other option, and who had begun, quietly, to recognize the shape of one. The report was brief. 3 outer territory stations had updated their compliance assessment frameworks in the week since the Lofan Agreement, not officially, not through Imperial administrative channels, but in the practical way of people who have identified a methodology and are applying it. The methodology they had identified was his. He read the report. He filed it. He looked out at the stars moving past him in transit, and did not allow himself the specific error of treating this development as anything other than what it was, a variable that had changed state, requiring updated assessment. But Anissa's loyalty numbers were in his head, the gap between warriors loyal to Thragg personally and warriors loyal to the position. The gap had been a number when she gave it to him at 11 years old. It was, based on what he was reading in the reports accumulating around his recent missions, beginning to behave less like a fixed number and more like a direction. On Viltrum, Thragg received the same reports through his own channels, read them with the flat attention of someone confirming a conclusion he had already reached, and considered, for the first time, whether his current timeline required revision. The Royal Guardian's official function was proximity. That was the entire job, distilled to its operational core. Stay close to the heir, maintain awareness of threats in the heir's environment, be the variable that stood between the bloodline and whatever the bloodline's enemies could arrange. It was a role built for a Viltrumite who had nothing else to be, and Nolan had been fulfilling it for 17 years with the precise, unimpeachable competence of a man who understood that the role was a cage and had decided that perfect execution of the cage's requirements was the only available form of dignity. He was good at it. He was good at it the way a person is good at the thing they have decided to be good at, because the alternative is acknowledging what the thing costs them. The costs had been accumulating in a place he did not examine. He had learned, in the first 3 years on Viltrum, that the examination produced nothing useful, and several things that were not useful. The specific category of feeling that Viltrumite doctrine classified as biological malfunction, and that Nolan, who had spent 20 years on Earth learning the human vocabulary for things Viltrum had no words for, recognized by its correct name and chose not to use. He grieved. He did not say so, he did not display it. He performed the royal guardian role with exemplary precision, and he grieved in the specific way of someone who was the cause of the loss. Not missing what was gone, exactly, but living inside the daily, compound weight of a choice that could not be unmade and that looked, from 17 years of distance, less like a decision and more like a wound he had inflicted and then walked away from. This was the interior architecture of Nolan Grayson on an ordinary morning in the 17th year of his son's life on Viltrum. He performed the role. He kept the accounting somewhere he didn't look. He waited for something he couldn't have named to change. The data point arrived through a secondary intelligence channel that Nolan had maintained since his years of external deployment. Not an official GDA channel, nothing that ran through Imperial infrastructure, but the informal network of signals that accumulated around a Viltrumite, who had spent 2 decades on an inhabited world and left behind enough contact points to occasionally receive noise from that direction. It was not a message from Debbie. She did not know there was a him to send messages to. She had buried a casket with his name on it 17 years ago and rebuilt her life around the fact of his absence. And this was information Nolan held with the specific care of something that could not be put down and could not be carried without cost. The data point was simply a name, a location, a record timestamp, the kind of information that accumulated in public administrative systems, a form filed, a registry updated, the specific bureaucratic residue of a person who was alive and living an ordinary life in a city on a planet he had left before she knew he was leaving. She was alive. She was in her current city. She was, according to the timestamp, alive as of 6 weeks ago. He should not care. He made the Viltrumite case to himself with the practiced fluency of someone who had been making it for 17 years. She was a person from a concluded mission. The genetic contribution had been made. The heir was confirmed. The equation had no further variables requiring her input. He held the data point for 4 weeks, then he pulled it up again and looked at it for 20 minutes and deleted it. Then he found the backup his system had created automatically and deleted that. He did not pull a third copy. He sat in his quarters in the Imperial complex, with the deletion confirmed on both systems, and understood, with the analytical clarity that he applied to everything except this, what the pulling and the deleting and the month that had taken to complete the process actually meant. He would not use the word Viltrum had for it. He would say he was managing a residual complication from a concluded assignment. He was wrong. He had been wrong about this for 17 years. He was aware that he was wrong. He managed the awareness the same way he managed everything else. The observation post above the pits had the best sight lines of any position in the complex that was not the throne plateau itself. You could see 3 of the active pit chambers from the north-facing window, the stone below occupied at this hour by the younger cohort groups, children between 7 and 10, still in Phase 1, still learning the first and most fundamental thing the pits taught. Nolan came here when he needed to think, which he did not acknowledge as a pattern, and which had been a pattern for years. He heard Mark before Mark was visible, the specific flight signature of his son's approach, the displaced heir of a Viltrumite who had learned to manage his velocity in enclosed spaces. Mark landed on the observation post's platform and stood in the way of someone who had identified the other person's presence before arriving, and had already processed what the arrival would mean. "You're here early," Nolan said. He was watching the pit below. He did not turn around. The Lofan debrief finished ahead of schedule. Mark came to stand beside him at the window. He was looking at the children in the pit below, reading their movements with the automatic assessment of someone who had spent 8 years in that environment. Anissa had a secondary briefing this afternoon. "I have 2 hours. And you came here. You come here when something is occupying you. It seemed efficient to find you." It was not intended as warmth. It was a precise observation about Nolan's behavioral patterns, delivered with the flat accuracy that Mark applied to all observed data. Nolan understood this. He understood it the way he understood most things about his son, completely in the technical sense, and in a way that did not touch whatever he was actually feeling about it. "I heard about the Lofan agreement," Nolan said. 47 hours. 48 was the parameter I gave them. Impressive, efficient, Mark said. Impressive implies I was trying to exceed expectations. I was meeting them. Below them, a child of approximately 8 years was attempting something in the pit that was not going to work and would result in significant pain in approximately 3 seconds. Nolan watched it happen and said nothing. Mark watched it happen and said nothing. They were both, in different ways, past the point where that particular event required comment. Nolan said, "You're thinking about the human, the one you left on Earth." Mark was not looking at him. He was still watching the pit below, his profile carrying the specific quality of someone who has delivered a statement and is not invested in the recipient's immediate response. He had not phrased it as a question. He had not phrased it as an accusation. He had phrased it as an observed fact about a variable in his environment, which was exactly what it was to him. And the gap between that framing and what the statement contained was the entire distance between who Mark was and who he might have been. "I don't know what You pulled a data point twice and deleted it twice in the past month," Mark said. "Your secondary channel traffic had a specific access pattern. I'm not monitoring your systems actively. The pattern came through the complex's administrative logs as a routine flag that I reviewed as part of standard security awareness." He paused. "She's alive. I know you know that." Nolan said nothing. Mark turned from the window to look at him directly. "It's been 17 years. Whatever that was is over." "I know that. Then stop carrying it. The weight serves nothing. It has no productive output. It doesn't change the mission. It doesn't change your position. It doesn't change her position. It just occupies processing capacity that you could use otherwise." There was a pause that had a specific quality. Not empty, not waiting, but full of something that either of them had a shared language for. Outside the window, the child in the pit had encountered the consequence of the thing that wasn't going to work and was now making the decision about whether to get up, which was the only decision the pits ever actually required. "You sound like Thragg," Nolan said. Mark was quiet for a moment. Not processing the statement, he had processed it before it finished being said. Sitting with his response, choosing it with the precision he applied to things that required precision. "I sound like the Empire." I thought that was the point. It was not said cruelly. That was the thing that made it what it was. There was no cruelty in it, no edge deployed to cut. It was simply accurate, stated by someone who found it accurate, and had no framework in which its accuracy was a problem. Nolan looked at his son, at the 17-year-old who had grown in this place into something that Viltrum had produced correctly and exactly and completely, and who was standing in front of him with the flat, diagnostic concern of a person who had noticed a structural flaw in a supporting element and was recommending corrective action. He left. He did not have a response that fit the space the conversation had available, and continuing without a response that fit would not improve the situation. He walked to the platform's edge and dropped into the air and flew back toward the complex without looking back, which was a thing he had been doing for 17 years in various forms, and which he was very practiced at. He was in his quarters for an hour before he pulled up the star charts. Not Debbie's location, not Earth's administrative coordinates in the Imperial Geographic Survey, the star charts. The actual navigational display, the full three-dimensional rendering of the local stellar neighborhood, the Sol system highlighted in the standard Imperial Survey notation, a yellow point in a field of 10,000 similar points. He looked at it for 31 minutes. He did not transmit anything. He did not move toward the planet. He sat in his quarters in the Imperial complex, on a world where the sky was the color of old bruises, and the architecture communicated power by refusing to communicate anything else. And he looked at a star that was too far away to see with the naked eye from the surface, and he did not name what he was doing. In the Security Operations Center, one level below the residential wing, a monitoring flag completed its generation cycle and routed to the Grand Regent's office through the standard administrative pathway. Thragg reviewed it at 0600 the following morning. The flag contained two components: the secondary channel access log, which Thragg had already reviewed through a separate monitoring pathway, and which confirmed the data point access and deletion sequence, and the star chart viewing duration, 31 minutes, Sol system, no transmission generated, no movement initiated. He closed the flag. He opened a file he had maintained for 11 years under a label that translated approximately as contingency options. He added 2 entries. He closed the file, he did not act on it. The timing was not correct. The timing would become correct. And when it did, he would have what he needed. And Nolan's specific, manageable 17-year-old grief would perform the function that Nolan's grief had always been going to perform, if Thragg was patient enough to wait for it. He was patient. He had always been patient. It was the one quality that the bloodline could not replace. He began his morning briefings. The Keth system assignment arrived with 6 Vanguard tier warriors attached to it. Mark read the briefing twice. Then he read the support allocation again, separately. The way you read something a second time, not because you missed it the first time, but because you want to confirm that it says what you think it says, and that the confirmation is as significant as you think it is. 6 Vanguard for a trade negotiation. With a system that had been flagged as non-compliant for 30 years through purely administrative means, no military action, no active resistance, no history of engaging Imperial forces directly, the threat assessment in the briefing's appendix used the word moderate, which in Imperial operational language meant a standard squad of 3 to 4 was sufficient, and 6 was excessive. Thragg had never given him excessive. In 2 years of missions calibrated consistently short, consistently under-resourced, consistently positioned so that death was a plausible outcome that could be filed as combat loss. In 2 years of that pattern, 6 Vanguard tier warriors was not a support allocation. It was a different kind of resource entirely. He cross-referenced the 6 names against Anissa's loyalty assessment. He did this carefully, in his own quarters, on a system he had spent 4 months ensuring was not running secondary logs to any administrative node connected to the Grand Regent's monitoring apparatus. 3 of the 6 had operational histories that ran exclusively through Thragg's direct command. The remaining 3 had general fleet experience. Not Thragg's people specifically, but not the kind of senior warriors who got assigned to trade negotiations either. He updated his assessment of the mission's actual parameters. He departed the following morning, and said nothing to Nolan. The Keth system's dead zone fell between its 2nd and 3rd planets, a stretch of space approximately 40 million kilometers wide, where the system's gravitational geometry produced natural communication interference. Signal lag in the zone ranged from 11 to 19 minutes depending on solar activity, which meant a transmission from the zone's center took between 22 and 38 minutes for a round-trip acknowledgement. In practical terms, anything that happened in the zone happened in isolation, and the isolation lasted long enough to be permanent if what happened was the right kind of thing. Thragg had not chosen the zone arbitrarily. It appeared in Imperial navigational charts as a standard transit hazard, noted and unremarkable. It appeared in the mission briefing as an incidental geographic feature of the approach route to the Keth system's primary inhabited planet. It appeared to Mark as the only location in the mission's geography where the communication infrastructure could not be used to contradict whatever account of events the surviving parties filed. He identified this on day 1 of transit and spent days 2 and 3 managing his perceived alertness level, appearing to the 6 Vanguard warriors in his company as a 17-year-old on a routine assignment, present but not watchful, engaged with mission preparation materials in the way of someone who has accepted the briefing at face value. He ate when they ate. He slept when the rotation suggested sleep, or appeared to. He was, in practice, sleeping in 3-hour segments and spending the intervening time in a state of readiness that he kept entirely interior. The Vanguard were professionals. They gave him nothing in their behavior that would constitute observable evidence. But professionals under orders make the same adjustments that any mission-oriented being makes in the hours before execution. A quality of focus that sharpens in a specific direction. A pattern of positioning that is not quite casual, the way experienced warriors' eyes move when they are mapping an environment for a purpose that differs from their stated one. He tracked all of it. He filed none of it externally. He waited. The attack came on the 3rd day of transit at the zone's approximate center. It was coordinated with the specific precision of people who had rehearsed the sequence, not in the gross sense of a planned choreography, but in the way of warriors who have been given clear parameters and have individually resolved how they will execute within them. No signal that Mark could detect, no verbal command. A simultaneous repositioning across all 6 that took approximately half a second, and which, if he had been the 17-year-old they had assessed him as, would have been the last thing he processed before the outcome was determined. He was already moving at the quarter-second mark. The first Vanguard warrior, the one whose approach vector was positioned for a throat strike, the same concentrated targeting he had learned at 13 against the wall of a pit, connected with empty space where Mark had been, and received in the same motion an elbow strike to the jaw that he had not tracked because it came from below his anticipated engagement plane. The impact was not terminal. It produced the specific result Mark needed. A warrior of that caliber, at full capacity, took 3/4 of a second to recover from unexpected significant impact. 3/4 of a second was a different currency in this context. He was into the second warrior before the first had finished falling. The second was better, had anticipated some adjustment, had modified the approach vector based on the first warrior's miss. The modification was not enough. Mark used the modification's geometry against it, let the adjusted approach commit, and hit the gap that the adjustment created, with the full output of a body that had been developed in the pits for a decade, and which operated under this specific kind of pressure, with the particular efficiency of something that had stopped calculating and was simply executing. The second warrior went into the hull. The remaining 4 came simultaneously, which was correct tactics, and which Mark had anticipated would be correct tactics, and which still produced the outcome that 4 Vanguard-tier warriors producing simultaneous force at full capacity inevitably produced against one 18-year-old, regardless of how well prepared that 18-year-old was. The hit that connected with his right side was the worst. He felt the ribs report in the specific way they had reported in the pits at 13. Not breaking. The structural integrity of his Viltrumite biology preventing the clean fracture a human body would have sustained, but compressing in a way that communicating clearly and would continue communicating for several days. He hit the far bulkhead and used it, pushed off before his momentum had fully died, redirected the force of the impact into his next approach vector, came back at an angle that cost the third warrior something significant in the exchange. The fourth warrior got him by the arm. The grip was Vanguard tier, the kind of force concentration that could, with the right application of leverage, produce outcomes that even Viltrumite physiology found difficult to reverse. Mark gave him the arm, used the concession of it to get his feet into the warrior's chest, and applied force at a vector that the grip had not been designed to account for. The grip released. The fourth warrior was functional, but repositioning. Mark was past him. The fight moved through the ship's midsection in the specific way of combat between beings who can produce structural damage without intending to. Hull panels developing stress fractures from impact forces that exceeded their engineering parameters, internal fixtures losing their mounting when a body hit them at the wrong velocity, the particular quality of destruction that accumulated in a space not designed to be a combat environment. He killed 3 of the 6 in the first 4 minutes, not because killing was the immediate objective. Killing was a consequence of what fighting at this level produced when one side was committed to a terminal outcome and the other was committed to surviving it. The remaining 3 he took down in sequence over the next 7 minutes, each engagement progressively more damaging because the accumulated cost of the first 4 minutes was a real variable that he could not ignore and which his opponents were trained to exploit. The last one standing was one of Thragg's direct command veterans. He was better than the others. He fought the way of someone who had been doing this for centuries and who had reached an assessment of the situation in real time. He knew the kill order was unexecutable, knew Mark was not going to be stopped by anything available, and had made the transition from executing a mission to surviving a mission without apparent difficulty. He was good enough that the final exchange cost Mark a laceration across the left forearm from a strike that connected in the moment Mark's timing fractionally degraded from cumulative damage. Mark took him down, not cleanly, with enough force to remove his capacity for further engagement without producing an outcome that rendered him unable to give testimony. He floated in the dead zone silence and ran inventory. Right side, ribs compressed, not broken. Functional. Left forearm, laceration bleeding at a rate his biology would address in hours. Additional bruising across the shoulders and lower back that would be significant by tomorrow and irrelevant by the end of the week. Nothing that changed his capacity to do what came next. He located the communications equipment of the 2 Vanguard warriors he had left functional. The kill order was transmitted via confirmed channel. Standard operational security, the kind of protocol that existed because Thragg was too careful to issue that kind of order verbally without a transmission record that he controlled, and which could be deleted after confirmation. The problem with controlling a transmission record was that controlling it required access, and access left traces, and traces were exactly what Mark needed. He spent 2 hours in the cold of the dead zone following the transmission chain backward through 3 layers of operational security architecture that had been designed by someone who was very good at concealing things and who had not anticipated that the person looking for the chain would have 2 hours and no reason to be gentle about the looking. The chain terminated in Thragg's office, not in a subordinate system, not in an intermediary account that could be attributed to independent action. In the Grand Regent's own operational infrastructure, with an authorization signature that was not a forgery and could not be argued as one, he extracted everything. Physical verification, the communication unit itself, with the chain intact in its hardware memory. The 2 surviving Vanguard warriors, restrained by improvised means using materials from the ship's engineering section. He turned back toward Viltrum. Nolan received the signal disruption through his monitoring system. At 1400 on the 3rd day of Mark's transit, a communications blackout in the Keth system's dead zone, where signal lag made blackouts impossible to distinguish from catastrophic silence. The system flagged it as a standard transit anomaly. Nolan flagged it as something else. He knew the mission composition. He had made it his business to know the mission composition, because the pattern of Thragg's assignments had been legible to him for longer than he had allowed himself to formally acknowledge, and 6 Vanguard-tier warriors on a trade negotiation had been legible from the moment he heard it, as the specific kind of resource allocation that had only one function. He sat in his quarters for 12 hours and did not transmit anything and did not move toward the Keth system, and did not speak to anyone, and did not do any of the things that a royal guardian whose charge was in a communications blackout in a dead zone could not be prevented from thinking about. He sat, and the room was the specific quiet of Viltrum at the night cycle, the pits closed, the city running at lower frequency, the bruised purple of the sky outside his window fading toward black, and he carried what he was carrying without putting it down, because there was nowhere to put it and no one to give it to. Mark's signal reached him at 0200, alive, returning. Do not contact Imperial Command. Nolan read it twice. He exhaled once, slowly, the specific exhale of a body that has been holding something for 12 hours and has received permission to release it. He sat for another few minutes in the room's quiet. Then he began preparing. He did not know precisely what he was preparing for. He knew the shape of it. Something had changed in the past 12 hours in a way that the previous 17 years had been building toward. And the preparation required was the kind that a person did when they had stopped waiting for a variable to change, and had accepted that it had changed, and that the change was now the reality they were operating in. He pulled up the star charts. He did not look at Earth's coordinates. He looked at the approach vectors from Viltrum's outer orbital ring, the entry points, the defense platform coverage gaps, the transit corridors that an experienced Viltrumite who had spent 2 decades flying Earth's solar system would know how to use. He studied them for a long time. He did not sleep before Mark returned. He did not transmit arrival codes until he was inside the planetary defense perimeter. The outer orbital ring's automated systems clocked him at 0340 local time. A single body at combat velocity, no ship, no escort, approaching on a vector that came in steep and fast from the transit corridor's far edge. The platforms went active in the standard sequence: acquisition, lock, identification request. He broadcast his codes at the moment the platform's targeting solutions were fully committed, which was the moment that stood down the platforms without providing the preceding seconds of warning that broadcasting early would have provided. He was past the outer ring before the supervisory alert had finished generating. The defense platform supervisor's log would later record the arrival time, the approach vector, the code broadcast timing, and a notation that read, "Non-standard protocol, review requested." The review was never conducted because by the time the administrative system routed the request to the appropriate oversight office, the appropriate oversight office had other concerns. Mark did not go to the standard arrival processing facility. He did not go to the Imperial Complex's receiving bay. He descended through the Spire City's upper levels with his 2 restrained Vanguard warriors behind him, still functional, still conscious, still carrying the hardware unit with the transmission chain intact in its memory, and he landed on the throne plateau at 0347. The plateau's restricted airspace protocols were not a physical barrier. They were an administrative designation backed by the understanding that no Viltrumite would violate them without cause sufficient to justify the violation, because violation without that cause was a political statement with specific consequences. Mark had cause. He had documented, extracted, hardware-verified cause, and landing on the throne plateau without filing an arrival notification was the mechanism by which he was communicating that he intended to use it. The stone beneath his boots was ancient volcanic rock, worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic and the occasional impact of beings landing on it at combat velocity. It was cold at this hour. Viltrum's night cycle dropped the surface temperature significantly, the dense atmosphere holding the day's heat poorly. The moons were up, casting overlapping shadows from the plateau's structure, and the sky above was the deep near black of late night, the stars visible through the particulate layer, in the specific way of stars seen through something that did not quite conceal them. He set his 2 restrained warriors down. He stood beside the hardware unit. He waited. Word moved faster than any official communication. The Imperial Complex's monitoring systems logged the plateau landing and generated an alert that routed to the on-duty security officer, who looked at the alert and looked at the identity attached to it and made the specific decision of a person who has encountered a situation that is above their authority level and acted accordingly. He woke the senior watch commander. The senior watch commander woke the plateau's administrative coordinator. The administrative coordinator cross-referenced the alert with the Vanguard mission roster and found what the mission roster told him, which was that 6 Vanguard tier warriors were currently in transit to the Keth system and were not expected to return for 11 days. There were 2 restrained Vanguard tier warriors on the throne plateau. The coordinator sent alerts to 6 sector generals who were currently on planet, and to the Grand Regent's office and to every senior command rank officer within the complex. He did not know what was happening. He knew that something was happening that required the people who made decisions to be present for it. By 050, the plateau had an audience. They came in the way of Viltrumites who have received information they cannot fully evaluate and have chosen to be present rather than absent while they complete the evaluation, not rushing, not performing urgency, but moving with the particular directness of beings who understand that position in a developing situation is a resource. The sector generals arrived first, then the senior command officers, then the warriors who had been on duty in the complex, and who followed the movement of authority the way trained soldiers follow it. They arranged themselves in the open-air structure's available space, the ancient stone tiers, the elevated observation positions, and they looked at the plateau floor. Mark stood where he had landed. He had not moved. His suit carried the record of the past 3 days in the Keth system's dead zone. The burn through the material at the left forearm, where the laceration had bled through, the stress fractures across the shoulder panels from impacts, the general evidence of a body that had been in sustained combat and had come back from it. He had not cleaned any of it. The evidence was part of the communication, and he was not going to dilute it. Thragg arrived at 051-2. He came with 6 Vanguard, not the 6 who were in the Keth system, a different 6, the ones whose current posting was the Grand Regent's personal security rotation, and 5 sector generals who had been with him when the alert reached him. And he moved through the assembling crowd with the absolute authority of someone who has been the center of every room he has entered for centuries, and for whom the experience of that centrality has become as natural as atmospheric pressure. He stopped at the plateau floor's edge. He looked at Mark. He looked at the 2 restrained Vanguard warriors. He looked at the hardware unit on the stone between them. His expression did not change because Thragg's expression at this level of political development did not change. It had been trained out of him by centuries of situations where expression was a liability. What moved behind his eyes was a calculation. Mark could see it happening the way he could see any high-level process happening in an opponent. Not the content of the calculation, but the fact of it. The specific quality of attention that indicated a mind working at full capacity against a problem it had not fully anticipated. "You have violated restricted airspace," Thragg said. His voice carried to every position in the structure, without appearing to project, without filing arrival notification. "I have evidence to present to the court," Mark said. "The court requires convening. This is the mechanism for requiring it. This is a breach of Imperial protocol. The protocol exists to prevent unauthorized access to the plateau. I am the Argol heir. My access is not unauthorized." He let that sit for 2 seconds, not for drama, but for comprehension. The assembled court needed time to process the claim and its implications, and processing required seconds. "I also have 6 members of the Grand Regent's Vanguard who were deployed to the Keth system on an assignment that was not the assignment described in my mission briefing. The quality of the assembled court's attention changed. Not audibly, Viltrumites did not produce the human sounds of a crowd reacting to information. But the quality of their stillness changed, the way the quality of held breath changes when what is being held becomes harder to hold. Mark crossed the plateau floor to the two restrained warriors and placed them at the open-air structure's center. He placed the hardware unit beside them. He turned to face Thragg across the space. "Tell them what you told these men," he said. Thragg said nothing. The silence lasted 7 seconds. Mark counted them not because counting was necessary, but because the counting was a form of patience. He was not going to fill the space, was not going to elaborate or escalate or provide any material that Thragg could use to redirect the court's attention. The evidence was on the stone floor. The two warriors were on the stone floor. The 7 seconds were the Grand Regent's opportunity to provide an alternative account, and the absence of an alternative account was its own answer. Mark turned from Thragg to the assembled warriors. Not the sector generals. They were political actors. They would calculate. He addressed the warriors in the outer positions, the ones who had been in the imperial military long enough to carry in their operational memory some recollection of the era before Thragg's administration, the oldest ones, the ones for whom the Argal bloodline was not a historical abstraction, but a cultural architecture they had been built in and had watched be dismantled. The Grand Regent issued a kill order, he said, transmitted through his own operational infrastructure, under his own authorization signature, targeted at me in the Keth System's dead zone, through 6 members of his vanguard deployed under a cover assignment. The transmission chain is in the hardware unit. The 2 warriors who survived can confirm the assignment they received. He paused. I am giving you this information because you have the right to know what you have been serving. He turned back to Thragg. His voice did not change register. It was the same flat, precise delivery it had been throughout, because he was not performing accusation and was not performing anything. He was stating facts in the presence of people who needed to hear them, and then making a request that Viltrumite law provided unambiguous support for. I challenge you, he said. Single combat for the throne. The court's response was not immediate. It moved through the assembled warriors the way structural change moves through any large body. Not all at once, but in a wave, the nearest positions processing first, and the processing propagating outward. Mark watched it happen, and read what it meant in the specific way he read everything. As data, as confirmation of a hypothesis he had been developing for years, as the loyalty numbers from Anissa's assessment demonstrating their accuracy in real time. Belief. Not in all of them. There were faces in the sector general tier that were carefully producing nothing, the political calculation running behind carefully managed exteriors. But in the outer ring, in the old warriors, in the ones who had served long enough to have been waiting without knowing they were waiting for a bloodline claimant who could put evidence on a stone floor and stand behind it without moving. In those faces, belief. Thragg read the room. He had been reading rooms for centuries. He was very good at it. He saw what Mark had seen. He processed its implications with the same thoroughness he applied to everything. And he arrived at the same place Mark had already arrived. The political architecture of this moment did not provide him with a procedure. There was no move available that did not concede something he could not afford to concede. Denying the evidence required engaging with the evidence, which legitimized the challenge. Refusing the challenge on procedural grounds was not available because the procedure Mark had invoked was unimpeachable. Bloodline claimant, evidence of treason, single combat. The law was the law. Thragg had spent centuries constructing policy around that law to ensure this moment could not happen. The moment had happened anyway. Name the ground, he said. His voice was level. It would always be level. Even here, even now, with the political structure he had spent centuries constructing in the process of pivoting against him, his voice was level. Name the time. Mark looked at him across the plateau floor, at the massive, ancient, gray-bearded figure who had knelt in front of an infant 17 years ago with an expression that communicated nothing and had been calculating the infant's death ever since. Here, Mark said, now. In the single moment before the court's energy shifted from political theater to physical reality, before the space between them resolved from a distance measured in meters to a distance measured in engagement. Thragg's mind produced one complete thought that he would not afterward acknowledge having thought. He had been built for this, not bred in the bloodline sense. He had no bloodline claim, had never needed one, but built through centuries of selection, training, and the specific refinement that came from outlasting everything that had ever been placed against him. He had survived things that had killed every other being that faced them. He had done this for centuries, and in all that time he had never once encountered something that made the outcome of a single combat genuinely uncertain. The prince was 18 years old, half-blooded, well-trained, demonstrably capable, alive when he should not be. But 18 years old, half the genetics, a fraction of the experience. Thragg was afraid of losing, not of dying. He had faced dying before and found it a manageable variable. Of losing. Of the specific outcome where the thing he had built his entire existence on, the premise that he was categorically superior, that his rule was not an administrative arrangement, but a natural fact, was demonstrated in front of every senior Viltrumite alive. To be conditional, he did not allow the thought to complete. He stepped forward onto the plateau floor. Thragg did not begin at half capacity. This was the first thing Mark registered in the opening half-second of the engagement. Not as surprise, but as confirmation of a hypothesis he had built from years of studying the Grand Regent's operational history. Lesser commanders opened at measured output, conserving, assessing. Thragg opened at full capacity because Thragg had spent centuries in a position where measured output was a luxury that only beings who needed to conserve could afford, and he had not needed to conserve against anything alive. The first strike was a straight line from Thragg's position to Mark's, covered at a velocity that compressed the distance between them to nothing in a time frame that Mark's processing had not fully modeled despite every preparation. He got his guard up. Partially. The impact hit his guard, and his guard hit him, and the force traveled through both in a single continuous transmission that sent him to the plateau's outer wall and into the volcanic stone of the elevated terrain beyond it. The wall was 3 feet of dense, ancient rock. It stopped being a wall when he hit it. He landed in the rubble of it 30 meters beyond the structure's edge, in the open terrain of the plateau's surrounding surface. Jagged volcanic stone, cold, the bruised pre-dawn sky above, the moon still visible through the thinning dark. He processed the impact inventory with the automatic efficiency of 8 years of pit conditioning. The guard had absorbed approximately 60% of the force, which meant the remaining 40% had been distributed across his upper body. Ribs from yesterday's mission reporting again. Louder. Right shoulder developing a new complaint. Nothing that stopped the next movement. He was back through the gap in the wall before Thragg had crossed half the distance to it. The return put Thragg in the position of someone whose follow-through had committed to a vector that was no longer occupied, and the position cost him 1.5 seconds of recalibration that Mark used to get inside his engagement range. Inside Thragg's range, the Grand Regent's reach and mass became partially neutralized, not fully, nothing fully neutralized force of that magnitude, but partially. Mark hit him 3 times in the recalibration window, and each hit connected, and none of them moved Thragg significantly. Thragg recalibrated faster than anything Mark had ever trained against. The exchange that followed established the fight's first truth. Thragg was faster than his size suggested, faster than any intelligence assessment had accurately captured, moving with the specific speed of something that had spent centuries, ensuring that the gap between its apparent capacity and its actual capacity remained wide enough to be lethal. Mark was fast. Thragg was faster. The margin was not enormous. It was sufficient. The first 8 minutes were Thragg's. Mark took the damage and processed it. Not stoically. Stoicism was a performance, and performance was waste. And waste was something the pits had trained out of him before he was 10 years old. He took the damage and ran it against the data he was accumulating, because every exchange in those 8 minutes was information, and information was the only resource he had that Thragg did not have more of. Thragg's sequences had a structure, not a pattern in the simple sense. He was not repeating combinations that could be memorized and countered, but a structure in the deeper sense of a combat vocabulary that had been built over centuries of fighting opponents who were, in the end, not that different from each other. Viltrumite combat doctrine was old and excellent, and had not been significantly challenged in generations, because nothing alive had made it necessary to update it. The doctrine was the same doctrine Conquest had forced Mark to continuously adapt against across years of unannounced visits to the training grounds. The same vocabulary whose structural assumptions Mark had spent that time learning to identify and work outside of. In the 9th minute, Mark stopped fighting Thragg and started reading him. The distinction was not visible from the outside. He was still engaging, still producing output, still taking hits that produced visible damage. But internally, the allocation shifted. Less processing toward anticipating the next sequence, more toward identifying the structural assumptions that the sequences were built on. The assumptions were old. They were built for opponents who fought within a recognizable vocabulary, who learned the same doctrine because the same doctrine was what Viltrum produced. Mark did not fight within a recognizable vocabulary. He never had. He had been trained against a being who had spent centuries refining Viltrumite doctrine, and who had forced his student to continuously evolve beyond it, and his half-human neural architecture gave him an adaptive processing speed that pure-blood Viltrumites, for all their physical superiority, did not have available. He began to anticipate. Not perfectly. Thragg was genuinely great, and genuine greatness did not anticipate cleanly, but partially. Enough to start changing the math. The fight moved off the plateau entirely as the second phase opened, both combatants' range exceeding the structure's boundaries, without either of them making a decision about it. They went across the plateau's outer terrain, the volcanic stone cracking under impact points, fault lines propagating outward from the places where force met ground at concentrations the ground was not engineered for. The lower spire cities, 3 kilometers distant, registered atmospheric pressure variations from the shockwaves as the engagement intensity increased. In the monitoring stations at the complex's base, equipment that had been calibrated for standard atmospheric events began producing readings that exceeded their normal parameters. The assembled court tracked them across the terrain from the plateau's elevated positions. They said nothing. There was nothing to say. They watched. Thragg landed the fight's critical near kill in the 23rd minute. He got Mark in a controlled hold, not a grab, not a grip, but a fully committed positional control, where leverage and mass combined to produce something that could not be resisted by matching force, because matching force was not available. He had been building toward it for 6 minutes, through a sequence of exchanges that Mark had been reading and partially anticipating, and that had been, Mark understood only at the moment of completion, not Thragg's actual sequence, but the setup for the actual sequence. He had been predicted and accounted for, and the accounting had been built into the approach from the beginning. Thragg was older than anything Mark had ever faced, and the difference between old and experienced was real. The force applied at Mark's collarbone was focused and increasing. The collarbone held longer than it should have, the specific density of Viltrumite biology resisting the pressure, and then it did not hold. The fracture produced an audible report in the cold pre-dawn air, and a specific quality of information through his body that was different from bruising or laceration. His right arm's functionality degraded immediately. The force continued increasing. He had one working arm, and a position that could not be broken by resisting it, and a narrowing window before the force reached a threshold that his biology could not continue to absorb without producing outcomes that were not recoverable in the time frame the fight allowed. He stopped resisting. He went with the force, not surrendering to it, but using it, letting Thragg's applied pressure direct his remaining working arm rather than opposing it. Thragg's hold required commitment. Commitment meant position. Position meant Thragg was also somewhere specific, and somewhere specific meant there was an angle. He swung, not against the hold. With it, using Thragg's own leverage as the generating force, bringing his left fist into the junction of Thragg's jaw and throat at the end of the arc that Thragg's grip had made available. The hit was not enough to end the fight. Against a being of Thragg's caliber, a single hit was not going to end the fight, but it was enough to interrupt something. The specific physical process of breathing and the muscular control adjacent to it disrupted in a way that produced, for approximately 1 second, a fractional loosening of the grip. Mark got free in the fraction. He landed 12 feet away on the volcanic stone, one arm non-functional, ribs from yesterday compounding with ribs from today, and he turned to face Thragg and recalibrated. The final phase took 14 minutes. Thragg was bleeding. This was the fact that the assembled court processed in silence as the fight moved back toward the plateau. Visible bleeding from 3 separate points, the result of accumulated exchange across 30 minutes of engagement at a level that even his extraordinary physiology could not process in real time. He was still moving at speeds that exceeded anything below the vanguard tier. He was still producing force that shook the ground when it connected with the ground instead of Mark. He was still, individually, the most dangerous thing on the plateau. But Mark had stopped being one thing and had become something more complicated. He was operating with a broken collarbone, and full use of one arm and a damage assessment that was significant but not conclusive. And he was fighting with the particular efficiency of someone who has stopped fighting the opponent in front of them and started fighting the specific vulnerabilities of the opponent in front of them, which were not the same thing at all. He had identified three. The first was the structural assumption in Thragg's closing sequences, the expectation that an opponent who had been pushed to defensive response would remain in defensive response, which was accurate for every opponent Thragg had faced before, because they had all eventually run out of the ability to do otherwise. The second was the slight overcommitment at the end of extended combination sequences. Not a flaw exactly, but a calibration set for opponents who broke before the overcommitment became a liability. The third was the specific geometry of Thragg's guard position when recovering from a redirected strike. He recovered to the same position every time, a century-old habit built in an era when there was nothing that could reach that position. Mark built the sequence across 4 exchanges, 3 moves, each one functioning as a component, none of them individually decisive, the combination producing a cumulative, positional displacement that terminated with Thragg's guard broken in the specific geometry of the third vulnerability, at the moment when the second vulnerability had been forced open by the exploitation of the first. The decisive strike was not the hardest thing Mark produced in the 40 minutes. It was the most precisely placed thing Mark produced in the 40 minutes, which was different and more important. Thragg went down. He went down in the way of something very large that has absorbed an impact it cannot immediately absorb. Not collapsed, not unconscious, but on the volcanic stone of the throne plateau, with his recovery system working against the accumulated damage of 40 minutes and the specific injury of the final sequence, and finding, for the first time in centuries, that the recovery was not instantaneous. He was still alive, he was still functional enough to speak. He was not mounting resistance. Mark stood over him, one arm broken, bleeding from the laceration the mission had given him, and 3 new points the fight had given him. He looked at Thragg on the ground, and he did not move immediately, which was not mercy and was not hesitation. It was political architecture, the final component of a sequence he had been constructing since he landed on the plateau at 0347. He turned to the assembled court. The Grand Regent committed treason against the imperial bloodline, he said. His voice carried without projection the same flat precision it always carried. He murdered Emperor Argal. He suppressed knowledge of the surviving bloodline for centuries. He arranged an assassination attempt against the confirmed heir in the Keth system 17 days ago. By Viltrumite law, the court has witnessed the evidence. The challenge has been completed. The verdict has been rendered. He turned back to Thragg. What followed was not performed. It was not spectacle. It was a precise final act, the specific sound of it reaching every position in the assembled court, and then the specific silence that followed it. The silence of a thing that cannot be taken back existing in the air, where something that could have been taken back had been a moment before. 3 seconds of complete stillness across the plateau. Then the sound began in the outer ring. From the oldest warriors, the ones who had carried for centuries a loyalty that Thragg's administration had never been able to fully capture, who had served because they had no other available option, and who had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for the thing that had just happened to happen. It was not cheering. Viltrumites did not cheer. It was something lower and older than cheering. A sound from the back of the throat, collective, building from the outer positions inward as it propagated through the assembled court. An acknowledgement that operated below the level of political calculation, a recognition that the architecture of legitimate authority had just been occupied for the first time in centuries. Mark did not acknowledge the sound. He had already turned from Thragg. He was looking at the horizon above the plateau's edge, where the pre-dawn sky was beginning its transition toward the bruised purple of Viltrum's morning, the particulate layer catching the first light and turning it into something that would not be called beautiful by anyone trained to evaluate things by Viltrumite criteria. He was already thinking about what came next. The Empire had a ruler. The sound behind him continued to build. He let it build without turning toward it, because turning toward it would have made it about him, and it was not about him. It was about what he represented, which was a different thing, and he understood the difference precisely. He stood in the wreckage of the throne plateau, with the morning coming in over the volcanic stone, and he was already working. The 6 months between Thragg's death and the Earth announcement were not a transition period. Transition implied a gap between what had been and what would be, a space of uncertainty while the new thing established itself. Mark did not produce that space. He moved from the throne plateau directly into the work, and the work moved at the speed of someone who had been preparing for it since he was 11 years old in a chamber above the pits, learning the administrative architecture of an empire from a woman who had not yet understood what she was teaching him to do with the knowledge. The sector generals, who had served Thragg personally, were reassigned within the first 2 weeks. Not removed. Removal was a statement, and statements produced responses that required management. They were redirected to frontline positions where their individual capability was genuinely useful and where their proximity to the Imperial Administrative Center was genuinely reduced. The ones who aligned quickly discovered that alignment was recognized, and that recognition was practical rather than ceremonial. The ones who did not align quickly discovered that the new emperor's patience for the process of not aligning was precisely calibrated to the point at which patience became more expensive than its absence. Anissa was elevated to Imperial Advisor in the 3rd week. She accepted it the way she accepted every assignment, without enthusiasm, without resistance, with the specific professional competence of someone who had identified the role as the most efficient use of her particular capabilities. She did not tell Mark she was glad he had survived the Keth system. She submitted a detailed analysis of 3 outer territory administrative inefficiencies she had been documenting for 2 years and had not had the authority to address. He read it the same day and implemented 2 of the 3 recommendations before the end of the week. Conquest was given permanent outer territory command in the 4th week. He received the assignment through official channels, acknowledged it through official channels, and was in transit to his new posting within 48 hours. He did not have a farewell conversation with Mark. He did not require one. He had produced what he produced, and it was operating at the level it was operating at, and that was the complete record of the relationship, which was exactly the record he wanted. Nolan remained Royal Guardian. The title had always been a cage, and was still a cage, but the cage's administrator had changed, and the new administrator had different reasons for maintaining it than the old one had. Mark did not explain this to Nolan. He did not explain most things to Nolan. He expected people to read the architecture of situations rather than requiring the architecture to be narrated, and Nolan was capable of reading it, and did. The full Imperial Assembly convened 6 months after the plateau. Every sector general present, every command rank officer on the homeworld, the senior administrative apparatus of an empire that controlled more of the known galaxy than any political entity in recorded history. They assembled in the open-air structure on the throne plateau, the same structure where the challenge had been issued, the same stone, the same bruised sky above, and Mark stood at the position from which the Grand Regent had addressed the court for centuries, and addressed it differently. He covered the first year's military agenda with the compressed efficiency of someone who had been building the agenda since before he had the authority to implement it. 3 disputed boundary systems, 47 subject worlds requiring compliance reassessment, administrative restructuring of the sector general reporting hierarchy to reduce the bottlenecks that Thragg's centralized authority had created, and which were, in Mark's assessment, a legacy liability rather than a feature. The last item was Earth. The planet designated Earth, Sol system, has been in administrative limbo for 18 years, he said. The original deployment was never officially concluded. The planet's status in Imperial records is listed as pending assessment. I am concluding the assessment. He looked at the assembled court, not at any specific face, at the whole of it the way he looked at any strategic situation. Earth will be formally integrated into the Empire. I will lead the campaign personally. The room received this with the specific quality of Viltrumite attention that functioned as enthusiasm, not expressed, just present, a sharpening of collective focus that was the assembled military's equivalent of leaning forward. A campaign with the Emperor at the point position was a different kind of deployment. It was a demonstration, a standard setting the new administration making its first definitive mark on the Empire's expansion record. The assembly concluded. Mark returned to the planning chamber. The tactical staff was already there. Approach vectors, atmospheric entry calculations, Earth's defense infrastructure assessment from the Imperial Geographic Survey, the intelligence apparatus's most recent compilation of the planet's active superhuman population. He dismissed the staff an hour later. He was still working through the materials when Nolan appeared in the chamber's entrance. He did not look up from the displays. Close the door. Nolan closed it. He crossed to the planning table and stood across from his son and looked at the approach vector displays and the population density maps and the defense infrastructure overlay that showed, in Imperial assessment notation, Exactly how long Earth's resistance capability would last against the force composition Mark was planning to deploy. "I know what you're doing," Nolan said. "I'm doing my job. You're testing yourself against Earth, against what I was and what I chose not to finish." Mark looked up from the display. He looked at Nolan with the complete, assessing attention he gave to every significant variable in his environment. "I'm claiming what has always been Imperial territory. Your extended deployment created an administrative complication. I'm resolving it. Those are people, 8 billion people. Who will be Imperial citizens after the campaign? The casualty projections are minimal if they don't mount sustained resistance. The GDA's infrastructure will be repurposed rather than destroyed. The population that cooperates with integration protocol will experience continuity of ordinary life under Imperial administration." He returned to the display. "The outcome is better than most integration campaigns produce. You're not giving them an option that looks like survival to them. I'm giving them the same option every world receives. The ones that understand it early produce lower casualty figures. The ones that don't produce higher ones and arrive at the same outcome." He moved a marker on the approach vector display. "Their choice. They don't know enough to make that choice. They don't know what's coming. They haven't had 20 years to prepare for it the way—" Nolan stopped. Mark looked up again. "The way you had." The planning chamber was quiet. The display cast its amber light across the table between them, the Sol system rotating slowly in the projection, Earth a blue point at its third orbital position. "You had 20 years, Mark said. You produced a genetic contribution that confirmed a bloodline and changed the political structure of the Empire. Whatever else you were doing on that planet, the outcome is that I'm standing here. The campaign concludes what your deployment started. That is not what I was doing. I know what you were doing." Mark's voice did not change. It never changed. "You were becoming something Viltrum calls a liability. I'm aware of what that process looks like. I watched you complete it from close range for 17 years. He looked back at the display. "The campaign launches in 30 days. Your guardian role is attached to my position. You'll be with the Armada." He looked at the Earth projection, the blue point, the third orbit, the planet he had left 18 years ago in the middle of a night that he had spent 18 years not examining too directly. He left the chamber without another word. Mark did not watch him go. He was already revising the approach vector calculations. Cecil Stedman had been building the Global Defense Agency into something for 20 years. He had done it with the specific, driven competence of a man who had received information about the universe that most humans would not survive receiving, and had decided to respond to that information by working. The GDA's monitoring network covered every approach vector to Earth's orbital space. The hero infrastructure he had cultivated and organized was the most capable defensive apparatus Earth had ever produced. The contingency files in his secure system covered scenarios that his staff privately categorized as science fiction, and that Cecil privately categorized as Tuesday. He was briefing his senior staff on an emerging situation in the Pacific Northwest when his satellite network flagged an anomaly at the Sol system's outer boundary. The anomaly's initial profile suggested a meteor cluster. The anomaly's updated profile, generated 4 seconds after the initial flag, suggested something else. The updated profile's contact count climbed from 7 to 19 to 41 to 88 in the 12 seconds it took Cecil to cross from the briefing room to the monitoring station. He stood at the monitoring station and looked at the display and did not say anything for 4 seconds. His senior staff, who had been with him long enough to read the quality of his silences, understood in those 4 seconds that the nature of the situation was the kind that Cecil's silences did not normally accompany. "Get me every active hero on this planet," he said. "Right now." He did not say right now as an intensifier. He said it as a time frame specification. He meant it literally. He returned to the display and began working through his contingency files with the specific, driven competence of a man who had spent 20 years preparing for a scenario and had just confirmed that the preparation was going to be tested. The Viltrumite Armada did not announce itself. It came in at the specific velocity of a force that had calculated Earth's monitoring network's detection range and had not modified its approach to avoid detection, which communicated something more precisely than any signal could have communicated. The detection did not matter. That you knew they were coming did not change what happened when they arrived. 200 Viltrumite warriors in formation. The formation was not decorative. It was a deployment configuration designed to cover Earth's surface approach vectors simultaneously, to prevent any defensive concentration from having time to form before the first elements reached their assigned positions. It had been used before. It had worked before. It would work here. Mark flew at the formation's point. His suit was the Imperial design. Not Thragg's design, not the Grand Regent's marks. The design he had commissioned in the week after the plateau, from the Empire's administrative office that handled such things. It communicated what it was designed to communicate, and nothing else. The Armada's approach created effects visible from Earth's surface in the upper atmosphere, pressure wave interactions, ionization patterns propagating across the atmospheric layers, the specific visual phenomenon of a large mass moving at high velocity through the exosphere. From the surface, in the right conditions, it looked like the aurora appearing in places and at times where the aurora had no business appearing. Mark came through the cloud layer above Earth's northern hemisphere and held position at the boundary of the lower atmosphere and looked down. The planet was blue at this distance. Blue and white, the cloud cover moving across it in the slow rotation of weather systems operating on scales that had nothing to do with what was approaching them. 8 billion points of light at night, 8 billion people moving through their days on the daylit side. 8 billion ordinary lives distributed across the surface of a world that had been in an imperial administrative ledger for 18 years as a line item marked pending. He had been born here. He had no memory of it. The fact of his birth here was a datum, accurate, verified, biologically documented, that had no more emotional content than any other datum in his operational awareness. He looked at it the way an emperor looks at a map coordinate. He had looked at it on the display in the planning chamber for 30 days. He was looking at it now without the display between him and it. He gave the order. The Armada descended. Earth's defenses lasted longer than the actuarial models predicted. Cecil Stedman had built something real. That was the accurate assessment, and Mark's tactical staff produced it without editorial because accuracy was the only standard the new administration applied to its reporting. The GDA's response was coordinated, intelligent, and demonstrated a specific quality of institutional competence that the Imperial intelligence apparatus's pre-campaign assessment had undervalued by a meaningful margin. It did not change the outcome. The margin of undervaluation was not large enough to change the outcome, but it changed the timeline. And in changing the timeline, it produced the specific experience of a very capable human strategist watching the thing he had built for 20 years perform at the highest level it was capable of performing, and watching that level be insufficient, which was a different experience from watching something simply fail. Cecil's monitoring network identified the Armada's deployment configuration within 4 minutes of atmospheric entry, and correctly assessed its purpose: simultaneous surface approach coverage to prevent defensive concentration. He redistributed his hero assets in the following 6 minutes to maximize coverage of civilian population centers rather than attempting to contest the approach vectors, which was the correct strategic decision given the force differential, and which bought approximately 40 minutes of meaningful defensive action before the coverage became too thin to sustain. The 40 minutes were real. People reached shelters who would not have reached them otherwise. Evacuation corridors stayed open longer than the campaign's baseline projection. Cecil's decisions in those 40 minutes were, by any reasonable military assessment, the best available decisions within the constraints he was operating under. The constraints were not survivable. Mark's tactical staff updated the casualty projections at the 90-minute mark. The GDA's command infrastructure was degrading, not destroyed, degrading the specific deterioration of a coordinated system losing the connections that made it coordinated. Cecil was still operating from his hardened command center, still issuing directives, still receiving partial acknowledgement from the assets that remained in contact. He was buying minutes. He knew he was buying minutes. The directives kept coming. Nolan had been with the Armada in the Royal Guardian capacity since departure. He had maintained his position precisely, fulfilled every functional requirement of his role, and said nothing during the 30-day transit that was not required by the role's operational parameters. He had also, during the 30-day transit, been making different calculations than anyone monitoring his operational outputs would have identified from those outputs. The Imperial Geographic Survey was comprehensive. It covered Earth's surface in a resolution that allowed administrative planning at the level of individual city blocks, which was the resolution required for integration campaign logistics. You needed to know where the population was to manage it, and managing it was the objective, not eliminating it. The survey had been completed as part of the pre-campaign preparation and had been distributed to all senior campaign personnel. Nolan had used it for one purpose that differed from its intended function. He had used it to find a street in a city that the survey recorded with the same neutral administrative precision it applied to every street on every integrated world. A street where a name appeared in the public administrative records as a current resident, a name attached to a life that had been rebuilt around an absence that Nolan had created and that the person living that life had not chosen. He had the street coordinates in his operational memory before the Armada reached Earth's orbit. He fulfilled his role for the campaign's first 2 hours. He tracked Mark's position, maintained the appropriate proximity, performed the Guardian function with the same exemplary precision that had defined 18 years of its performance. Then he filed a tactical assessment update, routine, expected, within his operational authority, that placed him in the northeastern residential sector for the following deployment period. He went to the street. The city was in the specific state of a place that has received warning and is in the process of responding to it, not chaos, because chaos required a dissolution of social organization that had not yet occurred, but the heightened, compressed activity of people making rapid decisions about what mattered enough to carry and what direction to move in. The monitoring network had given 40 minutes of warning before the first elements reached the surface. The 40 minutes had been used. Nolan descended to street level in a residential block, where the evacuation was still in progress. The people moving around him registered his presence with the specific response of a civilian population encountering a superpowered being during a crisis. A wide berth radius, accelerated movement, no direct engagement. Nobody stopped to evaluate what he was. They were moving, and he was a reason to move faster. She was at the far end of the block. He recognized her before she could have recognized him, because he had been carrying her face for 18 years in a place he did not look directly at. And the face he was looking at now was the same face 18 years older, which meant it was different in the specific ways that 18 years on a person's face are always different and identical in the ways that did not change. She was moving people, organizing the block's remaining residents toward the shelter corridor, checking doorways, the specific practical competence of someone who had spent a lifetime being the person who figured out what needed doing and did it. She had not changed that. He had not expected she would. A Viltrumite subunit came around the corner at the block's far end. 4 warriors, assigned to the residential sector for population containment, not extermination, containment, the standard integration protocol for civilian populations in the first campaign phase. Their presence in this block at this moment was operational routine. He landed between them and Mark Grayson before the subunit had completed its threat assessment of the street. The subunit's senior warrior looked at him, registered his face, his imperial markings, his royal guardian designation, processed the situation with the competence of a trained Viltrumite, and arrived at the accurate conclusion that this was not a standard containment scenario. "Royal Guardian," the senior warrior said, "this sector is assigned to our unit." "I'm aware," Nolan said. "Adjust your route." "Our orders come from the tactical command. Adjust your route." The senior warrior looked at him for a moment, longer. Then he looked at the markings again. The Royal Guardian designation, the Imperial identification that placed Nolan in the command hierarchy above a standard subunit. He made the calculation that a professional soldier makes when the tactical situation contains a variable that exceeds his immediate authority to resolve. He did not adjust his route. He transmitted a query to tactical command and waited for the response, which was the correct procedural decision, and which told Nolan that the query would reach someone who would give an answer that made the next several minutes what they were going to be. Nolan hit the senior warrior before the transmission had finished. The fight that followed was not clean. 4 Vanguard-equivalent warriors in a residential street against 1 Viltrumite who had spent 18 years in an administrative role that had not required him to fight, and who was operating on something that was not quite strategy and not quite rage, but was functionally similar to both in its effect on his output. He was worse than he had been. That was the honest assessment. 18 years of Royal Guardian duty had not kept his combat capability at the level it had been when he returned from Earth. He was still a full-blooded Viltrumite with 2,000 years of experience behind his muscle memory. And muscle memory at that level did not degrade to uselessness, but the precision was reduced. The speed was reduced by a margin that was meaningful against opponents of this caliber. He took damage that he would not have taken 18 years ago. The second warrior got through his guard in the fight's 3rd minute and hit him in the ribs with concentrated force that produced a result he could feel interfering with his next 3 movements. The third warrior coordinated with the fourth, in a combination that connected with his left side and left him managing the momentum of it for 2 full seconds. That cost him? The cost was the second warrior getting a position he had to respond to rather than choose. He won, not because he was better than 4 Vanguard-equivalent warriors. He won because he was desperate in the specific way of someone who has stopped calculating outcomes and is doing what they have decided must be done regardless of outcomes. And desperation has a physics that pure capability does not always account for. He stood in the residential street, with the 4 warriors down around him, and the specific inventory of his body's current condition reporting from multiple points simultaneously, and he turned around. She was still there. She had not run, had not been able to run. The evacuation corridor behind her had closed when the subunit appeared at the block's far end, and she had stayed because staying was what the situation had left available to her. She was looking at him, at his face, at the face that she had last seen at a distance in the dark of a night 18 years ago, which was not how she remembered it because she did not remember it that way. She remembered a casket, an absence, a grief that she had rebuilt her life around the fact of. "You're supposed to be dead," she said. He looked at her. At 18 years of life lived after a loss he had manufactured, at the face he had spent 18 years not looking at directly. "I know," he said. He turned back to face the street. The tactical command's response to the subunit's query reached the senior warrior's communication system 30 seconds after Nolan had rendered him unable to receive it. The response was routed upward automatically, standard protocol for unanswered queries from engaged units. It reached Mark's tactical display as a flag, Royal Guardian Northeastern Residential Sector, engaged with Imperial subunit, status unclear. Mark looked at the flag for a moment. He processed it against the information he already had. Nolan's behavioral trajectory over 18 years, the star chart viewing, the data point access and deletion, the quality of silence that had characterized the 30-day transit. He processed it against the decision he had made 18 years ago when he filed Nolan's grief as a contingency variable rather than eliminating it as a liability, which he had been capable of eliminating and had chosen not to. For reasons that lived in a part of his processing he did not directly examine. He updated Nolan's status from Guardian to Hostile. He noted the sector coordinates. He redirected his personal trajectory. He found them in the residential street. The 4 warriors down, Nolan standing. A civilian woman 20 meters behind Nolan, who Nolan was not looking at because Nolan was looking at him. Mark landed at the street's far end, 20 meters between them. The city around them was in the specific state of the campaign's second phase. The acute resistance largely concluded, the containment protocol beginning, the sounds of a civilization in the process of becoming something other than what it had been. "I can't let you do this," Nolan said. "You're not in a position to stop me." "I know. I'm trying anyway." Mark looked at him. At the damage he had taken from the subunit, the ribs, the left side, the specific way he was holding his body to manage what it was reporting. At the face of a man who had made a decision that had no strategic logic, and had made it anyway. "Why?" Mark said. It was a genuine question, not rhetorical, not a device. He had been asking it internally since the flag appeared on his display, running it against every framework he had for modeling behavior, and finding that none of the frameworks produced a satisfying answer. Why, when the outcome was predetermined and Nolan knew the outcome was predetermined, did the action happen anyway? Nolan said, "Because I owe it, because I did something wrong a long time ago, and I have been calling it a decision ever since." Mark was quiet for a moment. "You're going to lose." Yes. The 2 syllables sat in the street between them. Not resignation. There was something in Nolan's voice that was the opposite of resignation. That was the specific quality of a person who has accepted an outcome and found that accepting it did not change what they were going to do, which was a form of logic that Mark did not have a framework for and which occupied his processing for the 2 seconds before Nolan moved. Nolan fought better than Mark had modeled. The model had been built from 18 years of observation of a Viltrumite in an administrative role, and 18 years of administrative role should have produced a specific capability profile. The profile was not what he was encountering. Nolan was fighting with something that his model had not adequately weighted. The particular energy of a person who has stopped calculating and is simply doing what they have determined must be done, which was not strategy, and was not rage, and was not anything that Mark had a precise term for. He was better than Nolan. Faster, stronger in the specific way of someone at the peak of their physical development, versus someone whose peak had been 2 decades ago and who had not maintained it. The gap was not close. He hit Nolan with force that should have ended the fight's first phase in 90 seconds, and found that Nolan was not ending. He adjusted. He hit him harder, and Nolan went down, and Nolan got up, and he hit him again. And Nolan got up again. He could not make him stop without exceeding the force threshold that produced outcomes that could not be reversed, and he did not exceed that threshold. He registered this about himself during the fight. The specific absence of the decision to cross the threshold, which should have been available to him and which was not, presenting itself as available, and he filed it in the category of things to examine at a later time, and continued. The fight ended when Nolan's body made the decision that his will had not made, when the accumulated damage reached the point where the signals from his body exceeded its capacity to continue overriding them. He went down and stayed down. Not dead, not unconscious. His eyes were open and tracking. Mark stood over him. The woman was 20 meters away, still in the street, not having moved. He looked at Nolan on the ground. He looked at this civilian, who had nothing to do with the campaign's military parameters. He looked at the street, the downed subunit warriors, the specific tableau of what his father had chosen to do with the knowledge that he would lose. He activated his communication system. Nearest containment unit to my position. I have a hostile guardian requiring restraint protocol. Take him alive. He turned from the street and rose into the sky and continued the campaign. And the campaign continued around him, and Earth became what it was becoming, and the processing that he had filed under examine later remained filed. And he did not examine it. Not yet. Earth's formal surrender came on the 17th day. Cecil Stedman delivered it in person. Not from a bunker, not through a proxy, not via transmission. He walked into what remained of his operations center. The hardened lower levels were intact. The upper floors had sustained structural damage in the campaign's second phase that had been assessed and left standing because the assessment determined it was not a safety hazard and demolishing it was not a priority. And he sat across from the Imperial Administrative Officer Mark had assigned to receive the surrender, and he provided the GDA's authorization codes one by one in the correct order, without being prompted for any of them. He did not speak during the process. His expression communicated what his silence had been asked to communicate, and the Imperial Administrative Officer, who had processed the formal surrenders of 6 worlds and understood what she was looking at, logged it accurately and closed the file. Cecil walked out of the operations center and did not look back at it. He had built it over 20 years. He had built everything over 20 years. Looking back at it was not something he was prepared to do yet, and yet was going to be a long time coming, and he understood this without requiring it to be explained. Washington, D.C. had been chosen by Mark personally, which every administrator in the imperial apparatus understood without being told, and which none of them logged in any official record because the choice was self-documenting. The city carried the symbolic weight of Earth's independent governance in a way that no other location on the planet did. It was not the oldest, not the largest, not the most strategically significant from a pure logistics standpoint. It was the one that meant something specific to the civilization that had just stopped being independent, and building the imperial capital there communicated something to both Earth's population and to the watching empire that a logistics optimal location could not have communicated. The throne was built from the materials of the Capitol building and 4 surrounding structures. This was logged in the official construction record as a resource utilization decision. The materials were available, the structural quality was assessed as adequate, the repurposing reduced import requirements. The construction record was accurate and did not contain the full information, which was that the decision had been made before the survey teams produced their materials assessment, and that the survey teams had been given coordinates that produced specific materials, rather than being asked to identify optimal materials. The throne itself was not ostentatious. It was elevated, positioned at the center of the structure's main chamber on a raised platform that required 12 steps to reach from the floor level, which meant that anyone approaching it climbed toward it and arrived below it. It communicated the same values as every Viltrumite structure Mark had grown up in: dominance as default architecture, comfort as an irrelevant category, power visible in the bones of the thing rather than layered on its surface. The bones of the thing were the capital's bones. Earth's institutions did not stand beside it. They were inside it. The civilization that had built them continued to exist, continued to work, eat, raise children, move through its days. Beneath it, This was the point. 3 months after the surrender, Mark stood at the administrative session that formalized the Empire's operational relocation. The announcement was the second major one of the post-campaign period, and it landed in the assembled court with the specific weight of something that changed a calculation that every warrior present had been making since the plateau. The operational center of the Viltrumite Empire, the fleet command, the sector general reporting structure, the Imperial Court's functional sessions, was relocating from Viltrum to Earth. Not the cultural center, Viltrum remained the spiritual homeworld, which was a politically sound designation that cost nothing to maintain, and preserved the loyalty of warriors for whom Viltrum was the foundational reference point of their identity. But the operational center, the place where decisions were made and implemented, was here, on a world that had been integrated into the Empire 17 days after the Armada's arrival. The sector generals processed this with the particular Viltrumite response to information that reconfigures the board they have been playing on. No visible reaction, complete internal recalculation, behavioral adjustment beginning before the session had concluded. Mark watched them process it and noted which ones completed the adjustment fastest, which ones were still running it when the session ended, and which ones were performing completion while the calculation was still active. The noting went into his operational awareness and stayed there. Anissa walked beside him when the session concluded. She said without preamble, "The sector generals are asking about the succession question. Through informal channels, they are not asking me directly. I know. The Empire has an emperor who is 18 years old and has not designated an heir structure. It is a legitimate administrative concern. You'll need to address it." Eventually, she looked at him with the specific expression of a person who has delivered a complete thought and is declining to expand it into an argument. She returned to her work. He returned to his. Nolan was present at the formal sessions. He was alive. He was maintained in the Imperial complex in reasonable physical condition. His injuries from the residential street had healed in the weeks following his restraint, his physiology addressing the damage on the timeline that 2,000 years of biology produced. He attended formal court sessions, in a position that communicated his status without requiring its narration: present, visible, alive, subordinate. He was not mistreated. He was not displayed with cruelty. He was simply there, in the Emperor's court, in the specific way of a permanent answer to a question that no one in the assembled court was asking aloud, because the answer was standing in front of them. At a session in the second month, a routine administrative proceeding covering trade compliance assessments from 7 outer territory worlds, Mark addressed the court on the general subject of administrative efficiency and, without pausing or changing register, used the phrase, "Those who mistake feeling for wisdom in the context of a historical analysis of 3 integration campaigns that had produced suboptimal outcomes due to command decisions, influenced by non-strategic variables." He was talking about something else. He was making a point about administrative history. The phrase was incidental to the actual point, which was about logistics. Nolan was looking at the floor when this happened. He did not look up when the phrase was delivered. He did not look up for the remainder of the session. He was present and visible, and he looked at the floor, and the looking at the floor was not something he performed. It was simply where his eyes were. Debbie Grayson was alive. She was in a city that was not Washington, D.C. She was a citizen of the Empire now, which was the same status as approximately 300 billion other beings distributed across the known galaxy. And the administrative apparatus that governed her daily life was not meaningfully different from the administrative apparatus that governed theirs. She was not imprisoned. She was not monitored beyond the standard population management protocols applied to all Earth residents in the integration's first year. She knew who Mark was. She knew what Nolan was. She had watched a man she had buried 18 years ago stand between her and 4 soldiers in a residential street, and take what they gave him and stay standing. And she was living with what that meant in the specific way of someone for whom the information does not fit any available category and must simply be carried until a category develops. No category was developing. She carried it. She did not appear in the Imperial Court. She did not appear in the official record of the campaign or the integration. She existed in the story's periphery as the specific human cost of a choice that had been made before she could have influenced it, by a person who had told himself it was rational, and who was now in the Imperial complex looking at floors. She was alive. She would continue to be alive. The Empire did not have a reason to change that, and the Empire operated on reasons. On a night in the third month, when the formal sessions had concluded and the administrative work had reached the natural pause of a day that had produced its necessary output, Mark stood on the elevated platform above the throne and looked at the sky above Washington, D.C. It was clear. The integration's first months had not been kind to the city's infrastructure in certain respects, but the atmospheric particulate that the campaign had produced was settling, and on clear nights the stars were visible in a way they had not been in the years before the campaign when the city's light output competed with them. He could identify Earth's sun from anywhere in the visible galaxy. He had studied the star charts before the campaign until the Sol system's position was as familiar as any coordinate in his operational memory. He was not thinking about Earth's sun. He was reviewing the resource allocation analysis that Anissa had submitted that morning and making marginal decisions about 3 items that required his direct authorization. Anissa was working to his left. The platform had space for both of them, and they used it the way they used everything, functionally without discussing the use. She said, without looking up, "The succession question will need a formal response within the year. Informal channels will become formal ones." "I know," Mark said. He returned to the resource allocation analysis. She returned to her work. The city below the platform was quiet at this hour. The integration's administrative schedule ran on a cycle that reduced activity in the late hours, which was not a concession to Earth's cultural preferences, but an efficiency determination. The optimal allocation of population energy across a standard period. The quiet was a byproduct of efficiency. It happened to resemble the quiet of a city that had existed before the campaign, which was not the same quiet, but resembled it closely enough that a person standing on a platform above it and not examining the distinction would not immediately identify the difference. Mark did not examine the distinction. He was working. In a room in the complex below the platform, Nolan was awake. He was lying on his back looking at a ceiling that was Viltrumite construction, dense stone, angular, built to the specifications of a civilization that had decided comfort was not a structural requirement. He was not crying. He had not cried in 18 years. He was awake and looking at the ceiling and carrying the specific compound weight of a man who has spent 2 decades calling a wrong thing a decision and has run out of the distance required to maintain the calling. The street was in his operational memory. The 4 warriors, her face, the residential block, the evacuation, the specific ordinary competence of a person managing a crisis in a city that was in the process of becoming something else. He had done one true thing in the street. It had not been enough to change anything. He had known it would not be enough to change anything. He had done it because it was the one true thing available to him, and he had run out of the capacity to do the other kind. He looked at the ceiling. The Empire continued around him. Above him on the platform, his son worked through resource allocation analyses with the flat, complete precision of someone for whom this was simply the next task in a continuous sequence of tasks that would not end, because the Empire did not end, and the work of administering it did not end. The stars above Washington, D.C. were the same stars that had been above it yesterday. They were the same stars that had been above Viltrum for the entirety of recorded history. They had no position on any of this. They produced their light at the distances they were at, and the light traveled and some of it arrived here, on this planet, on this night, indifferent to everything it illuminated. Mark did not look at the stars. He was working. The throne was occupied. The Empire continued. The work did not end. This was the world now. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.